Hi, thanks everyone. Sorry, we just had IT problems, but we can start now. So thanks everyone for coming to Scrutiny. We have an interesting soundtrack, but hopefully shouldn't disrupt anything too much. Um, I'll get started. First item is apologies. Alice, are there any?
Thank you. So we've had apologies from Councillor Aziz and her substitute is Councillor Raymond, and then we've had apologies from Councillor Arshad and we have Councillor Hollingsworth substituting.
Thanks. Are there any declarations of interest on any items? No, looks like we're all good. Item 3, there aren't any chair's announcements, and Mike's not here, so there's none from him either. Item 4 is the minutes. Are we all happy to approve minutes of the 6th of November? Does anyone have any? Okay, I think someone needs to second that. Cool, Chris. Yeah, and I think we need to vote that through as well. Everyone happy? Cool. And excellent, thanks. As now has sort of become our tradition, the suggestion is going to be that we take items not in the agenda in the order on the agenda, but that we'll take items 8, 9, 10 and 11 next, and then go back to 5, 6, 7 and 12, basically all of the admin at the end, just to save officers and cabinet members time. So unless anyone objects, we'll go ahead and do it like that. Perfect, great. So item 5/item 8 is the authority monitoring report and infrastructure funding statement. I think we've got Louise, Rachel Williams, Alexander Sutton, Lorraine Freeman and Lan Nguyen, sorry, I'm not sure how to say that, to do this item. Are you able to come up and introduce the report?
Rachel and Lorraine, just on that, just so you're
okay. Yeah, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Lucy, thank you very much for bringing us forward in the agenda as well. That's very kind. So I think the last time I was here, it was for the local plan itself, which, as you know, is the council's tool for achieving all sorts of objectives that we have, all sorts of policy objectives, whether those are economic, social or environmental. For example, proportion of social housing we asked for developers, that kind of thing. So this authority monitoring report basically is a statutory document, and it measures how well we are delivering on the policies in the plan. So it's very much a sort of a retrospective about how it has gone over the last year, what has been going on. So, for example, you can see how we're doing on, for example, employment sites. You can see there's no new sites been built on, and there's been a small loss of employment sites, but an increase in sort of meters squared of employment space as buildings have been built. Other highlights, interesting things in there about sort of the number of the University of Oxford students. Of its 29,500 students, only 678 are living out, which is a drop on the year before. Whereas with Brooks, of their 16,000 students, they've got nearly 3,000 living out, and that's a slight increase. You can see that 554 dwellings were completed, of which 273 were affordable, which is fantastic. That's 49.3% of them, which is really, really pleased to see, especially particularly as over 80 of those were actually on council land, because that is, one thing that we are really committed to doing is bringing forward as many social houses on our own land as possible. And of course, the all-important 5-year land supply, which has to be for more than 5 years, otherwise government can start stepping in and making life difficult for us. We've got 5.49 years. Obviously, so I think that's making us in a better spot than quite a few of our surrounding districts. So various good things in the AMR, and then there is the IFS for another acronym, which gives you a rundown of the CIL, the Community Infrastructure Levy, how much has come in, just over 2 million, how much have we spent, again, just over 2 million, how much we've got kind of in outstanding demands. It also outlines the Section 106 contributions or deals that have been finalised, and what those have been allocated for, which of course is mainly affordable housing, which is fantastic. It's going to fund has funded about 87 units of affordable housing. all sorts of things also on green spaces, whether that's putting lights on hockey pitches or improving play areas, that kind of thing. Just wanted to flag one thing that the Scrutiny Committee asked for in the past, which was to see the housing delivery on particular allocated sites, which Scrutiny's asked for in the past, and officers have included this time. At that point, I will hand over officers to see if they've got anything to say, but I just want to say that I thought it was, I hope you agree that it was both were exceptionally sort of clearly written reports and easy to understand and well presented, which is, of course, thanks to these two and nothing to do with me.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, officers, if you want to add anything, please do. No, that's absolutely fine. I'll get started on questions. Alex, and then Chris. If you've got multiple questions, can you ask them all at once?
It wasn't a question. I work for Oxford Brookes University. I don't have anything to do with student numbers, but I teach mostly distance learning graduate students. I don't think it's a declarable interest, but I'd like to put it on record.
Yeah, no worries. In that case, Chris and then James, if you just go straight after each other and then we answer questions in a batch.
It turns out when I press this button, it bills me as Alex Hollingsworth. So I press this one, perhaps. Yeah, let's see what happens if I press that. Yay, that says I'm me and pans to this chair. There we go. We can make this work, people. It goes to this one. Yeah, there we go. Hello, everybody. Sure, that's lovely. Let this not reflect on the general level of organisation. This committee, mistakes entirely my own, of course. Right, questions about students and student numbers. It was noteworthy that in the trajectory of student numbers and exclusions and so on, that the total numbers pre-exclusions had been sort of fairly substantially outpacing the volume of students that they are obliged to house. Sorry. So first question really is, do we know what category of exclusion is mostly contributing to that? Is that lots of new postgrad students, which obviously we wouldn't normally expect them to house in halls, but does still present a housing pressure? Or is it one of the other categories of exclusion that was contributing to that? A sort of sub-question to that, can you elaborate a little bit on what the step changes in 2020-21? There's presumably a change in methodology, both to the measuring of how many students there are and also how many units of accommodation they're providing, because there's quite a large step change in both of those numbers for the year 2020/21, which I think is also the onset of the measuring under the new local plan. So presumably the definition of one or both of those things changed. And then the last thing on student numbers is I note Brookes look to have their total accommodation provided looks to have gone down by about 500 units in the last year. I just wondered if we knew any detail about what the story is there.
Maybe given that was quite a lot of questions already, Louise and officers, do you want to answer those ones first?
Please, okay. I'm going to make a crack and you two can correct me if I go wrong. So I think the student numbers does not include postgrads because they're considered to be kind of like young professionals. So the student numbers is undergraduates. So I think the kind of people that are excluded are those who already lived in Oxford, so could well be living at home. People on part-time courses, I think, get excluded.
Can I just interject very briefly? So there is a list of exclusions, one of which is postgrads, or I think it's research, specifically research study is one of the exclusion categories. So in the table, you've got the leftmost column, which is the sort of gross number before exclusions, and then you've got the net number after exclusions. And so what I noted was that the gross number was climbing really quite quickly compared to the net. And I was just wondering if we knew what category it was that was contributing to that. If that's not a figure we have to hand, then an async answer would be appreciated.
Yeah, it's certainly something that we have the details on in terms of breaking those those numbers down over the years. So it might be something that I just need to double check in the change from last year. And we can get back to you on that one.
And
Okay,
then the
then
other
the
bits
step
were the step
change
change and
numbers.
the minus 500 units for Brooks.
Okay, I'm guessing the step changes because of COVID. Lots of people, lots of students not coming. And I think the Brooks numbers dropping dramatically was when the weekly campus closed.
Yeah, I think one issue that the university's been having is looking at their international students. I know there have been discussions in certain accommodation where they're potentially looking at redoing accommodation and looking for the students that they would accommodate, just because, yeah, there's been a change in the demand for those kind of places. So that might look to alter that step change. And I think possibly to do with, is it Clive's student booth there, in terms of, I think more places will come available. So in terms of the changes that we're doing in terms of where they're housing accommodation, but I believe that we'll see an increase in that in the coming years when that development is fully completed.
Thanks. Was there any, do you want to add anything, Louise?
I think so. Is that okay, Chris? Is that nothing else?
Great. We'll go to James. Are there any other questions as well? Let's just go to James then.
Okay. First of all, I want to congratulate you. I thought this was a very readable report. I learned a lot. Thank you very much. I mean, I have one or two questions which I think are about the same sort of topic. I mean, first of all, we have all of these various colleges, so-called colleges, schools, whatever you like to call them, which build on the reputation of Oxford. They're ones that are more like sixth form, but they do more. They're sort of trying to be aspiring private schools like St. Clair's, Doverbrooks, and so on, who are very big property owners now. And they're the other ones, which I believe, if you look at, for example, Unite, all along London Road, you've got the student castle by the railway line. I just wonder, are they in any way captured in the data that you have? Because they're all examples, as far as I know, of pressure on housing within the city. That's one question, really. And do we have any control over those numbers? As I recall, the inspector refused to let us cap those numbers. Alex may be able to confirm that, but I thought we were not able to limit what goes on in those sort of establishments that are basically playing on the reputation of the city as the two big universities. That's one kind of question. Another thing is, when we have data, I quite like it when we get time series. Now, you do have some time series, but what I'd like, and I'm sure you have it, is data on changes in the full and part-time student numbers over the past years going back pre-COVID. And I just wonder how it relates to the growth in student accommodation. And again, I'd quite like to know what's happening with all these other establishments that play on the city, on the big university's reputation. When you get, and I'm just looking at it, which I think might be related to Chris Moten's, one of his questions, page 60, table 7, where there's a sudden drop, and I'm not quite, this is University of Oxford, I'm not clear how much is due to COVID, but there's some comment about rebasing. I just want to know what the rebasing's about. Does it mean that it's apples and oranges when you look at the series? Two maybe less big questions, because I've got other comments here about these other institutions, but do we have data? You've got net dwellings permitted, but of course that's not the same as completions. And I don't know what the lag is, whether some are never, I think some lapse and so on. I just wonder if you can give some indication of how permitted net dwellings relates to actual likely completions. And the last thing is when you're looking at heritage assets, the one that sounds, well, one is going, there are two churches recognised. One is going to be demolished and rebuilt. That's in Blackbird Leys. The other is St Thomas the Martyr Church, and it sounds as if it's in a parlous state. I'm just interested what, if anything's being done to protect it. Thank you.
Louise or officers, whoever wants to respond.
I'm going to definitely need to hand over to officers on that. So first one was really about, can we limit the sixth form student numbers?
So sixth form, I don't know, they do all kinds of teaching, and ones that claim to be sort of university level, I think.
Yeah, so I think the answer to that there would be that we don't have a cap for those other colleges. So at a sixth form level, that's not something that we look to sort of have policy for specifically on those. So yeah, that's not something that we're involved with.
Is it possible to have data on the numbers? Because all I can say is you go up Banbury Road, Woodstock Road. I know it's a bit difficult because some are university college annexes, but there are vast amounts of property now that belong to these various institutions, and they are steadily taking housing away from the rest of the city.
Yeah, I think so private student halls in terms of the universities, that's something that we do include in the figure. But in terms of the sixth form college level, that's something that there could be somewhat of a competing factor in there, and that's not something I don't think we've got sort of particular data on that.
Is it perhaps a question around those, like, I get there's lots like language schools and colleges of kinds that like aren't the university but aren't schools, and maybe like how they're captured within the figures?
I may, through you, I mean, we know they're the two big, I think they may have more, Unite blocks on London Road, Headington. I assume they're classified as Brooks, but I honestly don't know. But when you come to that so-called Student Castle block, which is all along by the railway line, that's actually quite large. Yeah, I don't know who even lives in that.
Yeah, so I believe that the Student Castle block would be in our figures if that's a Unite block. So that will be accounted for. One thing to note with sort of language schools and anything particular with sort of holiday studies is it's quite a transient group in terms of the population. They may come in and out of the city during summer. So that's also something to be aware of in terms of the times on them. But yeah, I believe that's something that's kind of left in the private market as such.
I don't know whether Rachel online would have anything to say about what we can do about monitoring kind of language schools, etc. I think she might.
Thank you. Alex is absolutely correct. We don't have a cap in the local plan policy on numbers for those other educational establishments, and therefore we don't monitor those numbers in the AMR. The AMR is purely a function of monitoring how well the policies of the local plan are doing. So we focused on those policies in the reporting. Alex is absolutely right. So developments like Student Castle and the Unite properties, they count towards, because they're tied to university residents, they count in the statistics, so they would be there. We don't have figures for those other educational establishments, I'm afraid. That's not something that we monitor and that we can report on in the AMR, I'm afraid.
I might use this as an opportunity to ask a follow-up question, which is if we can't monitor it because it's not in this local plan, is it in the next local plan? So then would it in future be monitored? And then just as sort of on a related topic to ask, it obviously seems good that the number of Oxford Uni students living outside student-specific accommodation has gone down. Are there any lessons there that can be applied to Brooks, or is it all obviously it's quite different. Students live in colleges and stuff at Oxford, but can any of what's happened there be applied to Brooks and try to help reduce the figure there?
If I come to that, if that helps. So they are quite different organisations. I'm sure there are lessons and some commonalities between the two, but they are quite different organisations. The way that the students live, part of those universities are quite different. I would say the Brooks ones, I think Councillor Upton touched on it earlier, that there is some flux at the moment about how some of the Brooks accommodation is being managed and redeveloped. I would fully anticipate that some of those numbers would come back up in the next local plan. In the next AMR. We touched on Clive Booth Hall, for example. That's an example where there are some temporary changes to the numbers, and you'd expect to see those correct themselves over time. But yes, we do have a suite of policies that try to encourage both universities to accommodate as many students as possible within purpose-built student accommodation to take that pressure off the housing market. So we will continue to work with both universities to do that as much as we can, and reporting this on an annual basis is a good way for us to keep that conversation live with both organisations.
Thanks. Are there any other questions from people? Oh, sorry, Louise.
I think we haven't answered half.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So there was another one about the drop in Oxford University student numbers between 2020 and 2021, where it suddenly goes from 18,400 down to 14,700. And we just wondered, did we have any idea why that was? So table 7. So I'm guessing that was COVID, but I don't know, Alex, if there was a change in, as you said, was there a change in the way they were counted?
Rebasing, that's all. I don't know what that refers to.
Do you mind my butting in, Chair? I found the answer.
Yeah, please do.
So if you look at the AMR 2019-20, the difference in the list of exclusions is research students. So the 2019/20 version only excludes research students who are past their 4th year and, quote, presumed to be writing up, which is an optimistic view of one's fourth year as a research student. Whereas the AMR for the year after 2020/21 excludes all people who are on research degrees. Concurrently with that, the amount of housing goes down. It's not clear why that is, possibly because specifically grad housing is also being excluded from the provision.
Does that sound about right to officers, Louise? People? Yeah. Did you want, yeah, Louise, come on.
James's third question, which was data on how does the number of permissions granted relate to the number of actually completed homes. Again, I would imagine it's because it fluctuates so much from year to year, and predicting who is actually going to build the houses they've completed is probably it's very difficult. But
so I think I can.
Oh, could you put some microphones?
We do monitor all permissions, and we do. It's a complicated thing where, for example, one site can have multiple permissions, for example. So we have a very dense matrix of all these permissions, which may then come into fruition, which we then monitor over time. And yeah, it's just keeping track of what's reported is primarily data on completions, but we also do have the permissions as well. But I think in terms of the meaningful data, we're actually concerned about actually how much is actually coming forth. So we do keep a track on both. There is a time lag, but that depends on a site-by-site basis as well. The individual circumstances on each development will differ. So there's no hard rule for that, as it were.
Thanks. Is that everything? Responses.
about the heritage assets.
Oh yeah, I think there was a question on heritage assets.
James was asking about whether the St Thomas the Martyr, do we know anything about what's happening to that church? I don't.
Yeah, so this section of the AMR is taken from Heritage England, and having done some research on that church, yeah, there's not too much. I don't think I found too much on that itself.
should we, if I might, what we tend to report on in the AMR is the buildings at risk, as Alex says, on the English Heritage Buildings at Risk Register. And what's quite useful to see is over time, some of those properties have actually come off that list. So the Swing Bridge, for example, was reported for a number of years on the AMR, but has had some refurbishment and has now come off that list. So hopefully this is a useful way that we can report and record these. And hopefully over time, we will see the list getting shorter.
Yeah, I'd just add to that that with the Church of the Holy Family in Blackbird Leys, there is progress being made on that. So that's maybe a good example where in a year's time, something might have happened and we look at that heritage asset risk register, and then there's maybe something to report there in terms of progress.
Thanks. I think that's all the questions now. Were there any extra questions? No? Great. Did anyone have any recommendations they wanted to suggest? No, I didn't know, maybe based on what you were saying, James, would it be useful to have some comparison of student numbers with pre-COVID numbers in there? I don't know if the dates go back far enough. Just maybe it would be useful just to have that as a bit of a like normal baseline, maybe. Alex?
The issue isn't the COVID, it's the redefinition, which has just been talked about, and the difficulty would be going back to the academic institutions and ask them to redefine all their students in retrospect. That might be quite a challenge.
Okay, in that case, if that doesn't sound practical, are we all adept?
Is there maybe a simpler recommendation in terms of just writing up what the change in definition was at that boundary and including that in future AMRs, so we don't have this discussion next year, including ideally what there will have been some corresponding change in grad accommodation or purpose-built grad accommodation doesn't count anymore, I guess, but I can't see what that was, but hopefully that can be dug up as well.
Yeah, let's have a clip, James.
And could we request, because I do think it may be more of an issue than we appreciate, would it be possible to request in future, to the extent it can be done, data on the number of residential units that are taken by these sixth form colleges, language schools, all of that category of other educational institutions? And I don't mean just short-term students, except some of these may be rolling students over the year, different groups. So, but they do take housing out of the housing stock.
I don't know if the conclusion was that that wasn't for this report because it's not in the local plan and this is just monitoring the local plan, but I might have misunderstood. I'm getting nods. Also, Alex.
Could I just ask for clarification on what James is asking for? Because if you're talking about a building which is residential and then converted into teaching accommodation, then that would need a planning permission. It would actually be recorded, I think, somewhere in here, somewhere. If you're talking about housing stock being rented out by a landlord to, obviously not sixth form students, but to students at a language school who are here for say 6 months or something like that, I can't see how you could differentiate between those tenants and any other tenants who are here for 6 months. I'm not quite sure what we'd identify.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like, I don't know if officers have any input on whether that's data they'd be able to include or if that's something you wouldn't really...
I think it would be quite tricky to find that data. And also in terms of, as you mentioned, with the policies that the document does look to review, that's not something that we have a policy on as such, so that would be tricky, but we can have a look, but I think that would be tricky to obtain that data.
In that case, perhaps just the recommendation that Chris S suggested on making clearer the change in definitions. Do you have enough detail for that? Yeah. Is everyone in agreement that that makes sense as a recommendation? Excellent. Has anyone got anything else on this item? Nope. In that case, thank you to Louise and Rachel, Alex, Lorraine, Lan for coming and speaking to us and answering all our questions. The next item is the equalities update. I think we've got Councillor Chapman, Helen Bishop and Gail Malkin to present this item. Oh yeah, and Gail is online. Thanks, and Nigel, whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for having us. This is our annual meeting with the Scrutiny Committee to discuss the Workplace Equalities Report, which is something we publish around about this time of year. It includes some obligations on us, not least to publish the gender pay gap for the City Council. We have to publish that by the end of March next year, put it and send it off. And then we also volunteered, if you remember, at previous meetings, to compile and publish on the council's website the data around the disability pay gap and ethnic minority staff pay gap. So all that material is in the report, and we've now started also to compile other data around protected characteristics. They're quite small samples, so I'm not sure how robust they are, but we'll see how we get on with that. So we may not publish that because it's only small sample, but so that's the equality pay gap issues. And then, you know, behind it is a much more fleshed out report about the challenge we face in making sure we have a workforce that is reflecting the city and able to serve it properly because it understands the city. And at the heart of that is a diverse workforce. And I think last year there's been some good progress made, and then one or two areas where it's been challenging and quite tough. I think there's been good progress made around the City Council workforce senior management team. It's good to see that about 50% of the senior management are women. A higher proportion are actually women right across the piece, but you know, if you're looking for a 50-50 split around senior management, we're pretty well there. We've made some progress around the percentage of staff from ethnic minorities who are in senior management. It's edging up gradually. The area which is proving tougher is moving the dial on the absolute number of staff from ethnic minorities. And there we are roughly where we were last year, fluctuates slightly, around 14.5%. That's where we are currently. I think in this report it was slightly lower. So I'm sure you'll want to ask me what we're going to do about that. And I'll be happy to answer questions about that and what specific initiatives we have going forward over the next 12 months to carry on attempting to move the dial on that one. But generally, I would say in culture and in inclusion and in making the council a welcoming place, there's a lot of detail in this report, which is very positive. The staff survey results are generally very positive. Groups generally do not show any serious concerns about different levels of experience, whether it's ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or disability, which is again positive. So I think, as I say, I think there's a lot of good things here, and some of the expertise that we have hired in the past 12 months around recruitment and around inclusion is starting to pay off. Because we're getting more applicants than we've ever had before for jobs from the different protected characteristics. Part of the issue is the throughput into absolutely getting the jobs at the end of the day, and that's something which we need to focus more on. So I think that's really enough from me by introduction. Happy to answer questions. And I'm with Helen, who's Head of Business Improvement, and Gail, who's the author of the report, who's online, who's really, really close to the data. So if you've got particularly data questions, I'm sure Gail would be happy to answer.
Yeah, Helen or Gail, did you want to add anything at this point? Or
yeah, good evening, everybody. If I could just set a bit of context, if I may. So this body of work is part of the overall council's people strategy, which defines the council's ambition for its workforce in terms of trying to be making sure that they're high performing, motivated, and of course efficient in delivering the outcomes that we want. The strategy itself has got 6 things, but I just wanted to assure you that every aspect of that is about the employee life cycle, and that everything that we do, whether it's developing policies or practice or culture, every aspect of that strategy, we're always looking at how we can improve the EDI lens that we're applying. And of course, there is a particular part of that strategy which itself is dedicated to creating an environment for equality, diversity and inclusion. So I just wanted to make that point. It's not just one particular thing, it's the whole way that we embrace that particular agenda. I'll hand over to Gail just to give us an overview of the 3 main focus areas that we're moving forward on, and she'll explain the actions that we're taking and the progress that we've made.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Gail. If you wanted to add something then.
Thanks, Helen. So the 3 areas that we're focused on are improving the diversity of the workforce, inclusive leadership practices, and also understanding our workforce in terms of data and employee experience. I just wanted to point out some achievements over the last 12 months. We've extended the reach of our advertising. Our lunch and learn sessions, which focus on things like Black History Month, Islamophobia, neurodiversity, have had an impact, I think, in terms of improving the inclusive feel of the organisation. We've had very positive feedback. Just last week, we had 2 women who work for Oxford City Council talking about why they wear a hijab and why that's important to them. So these sorts of sessions are improving inclusion, and also, we hope, improving individuals' sense of belonging. Another success this year is we're now about to launch a race, ethnicity and cultural heritage staff network. We've really struggled to get this off the ground. 12 months ago, we had no interest, but through some cajoling and also through lunch and learn sessions that demonstrates the organisation's commitment, we've now got a small group of employees who are interested in being part of this network. And just in terms of what's planned, we're planning some training for managers. We want to work hard at getting more people to share their personal data. And we are planning a management development programme next year for people who are underrepresented at more senior levels. And they are women and people from minority ethnic groups. Thank you.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Are there any questions? Okay, lots of questions. Have people got multiple questions, or have you got one each? Okay, you've got multiple. Chris, you go first.
Apologies. Thank you. Sorry, I do have 4 questions. Apologies. But hopefully they can be quite quick. So the first one was around the issue of BAME representation within the workforce. And the papers, I think if I was understanding it right, suggested that there's been an increase in applicants, but a decrease in appointments from candidates from BAME backgrounds, which suggests, I think, that there's improvements in terms of advertising, in terms of reaching those groups of people, but there may be issues at the stage of the recruitment process. And I guess from the detail we had in the papers, it wasn't clear whether at which stage of the recruitment process we're seeing the drop-off, whether it was at application stage or whether it was at interview stage, and therefore what actions are needed to address that if there is a recurring issue there. So it'd be useful to get some more clarity on that. The second question I had was around the percentage, the council's workforce reflecting the local community, specifically in relation to Muslim staff members. So one of the biggest areas of underrepresentation I could see from the figures throughout the papers was among Muslim staff. I think the figure is 1.9% of the staff is Muslim, whereas Oxford is 7.2%. That's quite a big disparity, whereas in other areas the disparity was less substantial. So I wondered if we could get some reflection on what we think might be going on there. And the final 2 questions I had were in relation to recommendations that Scrutiny made on last year's report. So the first one, really, really grateful that we've started to get the data on the pay gap around sexuality, which was a recommendation that Scrutiny made last year. The sort of second part of that recommendation we made was about reporting on what's being done to support, to address any pay gap around sexual orientation. So I wondered if we could get any commentary on that. And then finally, another recommendation that was made last year was around reporting on what's being done to support trans and non-binary staff members. We recognised at this committee last year that the numbers are likely to be very small, and so we didn't want to have published data on the number of trans and non-binary people and their pay grades and that sort of thing, because they may not be publicly out, and we didn't want to jeopardise that. But we did ask for sort of reporting on what's being done to support trans and non-binary staff within the organisation, and it'd be useful to get some further information on that. I think that's all from me. Sorry it was so long.
Thanks. Nigel or officers?
Questions, thank you very much for them. I just think I'd maybe just touch on the second one, because I mean, I'm not absolutely across all the detail why a particular ethnic group is underrepresented. I just know that ethnic groups are generally underrepresented in the workforce. And that issue is becoming more stark because you've just had a new census come out in 2021, which shows that something like 27% of Oxford's population are economically active from ethnic minority groups, and therefore the original sort of benchmark of 15% we'll have to review. So I think we'll have to review that issue in the context of the wider number, okay? And we'll have to come up with some new targets, frankly, over the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years around what would be a reasonable level of expectation about the makeup of the workforce. The only caveat I would put in that, you know, you have to be careful about looking at the workforce numbers against the percentage of population from an ethnic minority group. It's whether economically active, that's the critical issue. And so then down, you have to bury a little bit harder down into that, because quite a lot of those people who are economically active just wouldn't be in a place to apply for jobs with Oxford City Council. A, because the level of their qualifications wouldn't be good enough. I mean, the level of literacy and numeracy issues in the city means that there's about 20% of those who are economically active who are really struggling to get a job in this sort of environment because they just don't have the core skills. That's the truth. Now, it's part of our job to help develop those core skills, and we are doing that with some of our literacy work and some of our digital work. But to be frank, we are a relatively small player in this story, and the onus of changing that story is down to the educational establishments in the city and schools and colleges and so on. So it's quite a complicated thing, Chris, to work out what the right proportion should be going forward. And that's something we're working on at the moment. And when obviously we'll have to come to a view about that in order to be part of the corporate strategy and the KPIs that are part of that. So I thought I'd just try a bit wider context than just, you know, the single dichotomy you pointed out. On the other 3 issues, I'll pass to my colleagues. I don't know whether you...
Yeah, I will start if that's okay, Gail, and then you can. Okay, thanks. So on your first, on the first question regarding, you know, we've had an increase in applicants, but that's not necessarily translated itself to actually employees in the workforce. We've done quite a bit of work with our EDI consultants, reaching out into the communities to get that increase in applicants, but recognise that actually, and Gail can comment whereabouts in that process it falls down. But we have got training sessions planned for managers, and we've already had one for members on inclusive recruitment, but we recognise that there's more to be done in terms of maybe having blind applications, which would be blind to name, qualification, etc., which we need to dovetail into our process, which I think would be a real benefit, particularly I think for the second question that you raised as well, Councillor. And also the other thing which we're starting to do is to have a much more diverse panel makeup, whether that's in interviews or at stakeholder stage. That can be a bit tricky with the number of staff we've got versus the number of interviews that we're doing, but we're most certainly making sure that we're doing that around the more senior and management appointments that we're making. The other thing, just before I hand over to Gail, is that we have we have introduced a new question into our staff survey this year, asking about how people feel they belong in the organisation. And we've been looking for data around for people, to declare their protected characteristics around sexuality, trans and non-binary. We've got quite small numbers at the moment, but we obviously, that's our first start, I think, is with trying to get that information. And we recognise that probably the numbers that we've got at the moment are small and maybe not be reflective, but it's beginnings of us trying to engage with that part of our staff membership. Gail, I don't know if you want to add anything onto that.
Yeah, just in relation to the first question. So we have seen numbers of applicants go up from minority ethnic groups, but that doesn't appear to be seen in the sort of new starter data. However, what's also changed is in terms of those new starters that don't share their personal data, that's more than doubled. So we've gone from 21% not declaring to 44% not declaring. So it's possible that some of those applicants were appointed, but they haven't declared their data or have chosen at New Starter to withhold that. The other point is that we're doing more applications by CV now, particularly around difficult to recruit jobs. And we don't collect data when people apply by CV at application stage. We ask them to provide that when they start. But in terms of collecting data, it's definitely a priority and we want to improve. Just in terms of the third question around sexuality and the pay gap, we've had a lunch and learn session hosted by staff from our LGBTQ plus staff network. So that's where employees talk about their life experience. And so what we're doing is it's part of our plan to become a more inclusive culture. In terms of trans and non-binary support, we haven't actually done a lunch and learn session, but it's something that we'd like to do. In terms of staff satisfaction measured through the survey, where people declare in the staff survey their personal characteristics, we don't see any difference in satisfaction overall from group to group. What we do have, though, is a prefer not to say group who complete the staff survey, and that group is far less satisfied than other groups of staff. And we don't know what the makeup of that group is. It could be older people, it could be people from minority ethnic groups, people with disabilities. But in terms of those people who declare, they probably feel more secure in the organisation. They don't appear to be less satisfied.
Thanks. I think Chris has a follow-up question.
Sorry, yeah, just two quick follow-ups. Firstly, I don't think we got a direct response on the question around underrepresentation of Muslims within the workforce. So it'd be good to get a response on what we think is happening there. And secondly, on the LGBT pay gap question, I think the Lunch and Learn events sound great, and that's a brilliant thing to be doing where people can talk about their experiences. I'm not sure how that relates to tackling the pay gap. People talking about their experiences doesn't change that issue, I don't think. That's more of a comment than a question, but yeah, the specific thing around the underrepresentation of Muslims would be good to get a firm response on.
Thanks. Oh, Gail, did you want to come back on that? Or
yeah, we don't know why we've got underrepresentation in terms of the Muslim Islam as a religion, but so that's something that we can perhaps look at, but at the moment we don't have any understanding of why that might be the case. In terms of this pay gap, the reason we focus on culture and inclusive leadership practices is because that leads to more acceptance, more inclusion, less bias in our processes around selection. And if there is less bias in our processes, then we'll find that more people from a whole range of groups are likely to be successful and progress their careers within the organisation and not be disadvantaged. And that's why these cultural aspects are really important.
Thanks. Imogen, was yours a follow-up question? Yeah, coming up.
Yeah, so with the lunch and learns, it's sounding like there's, in terms of relating what Chris was talking about in terms of pay gap and sexual orientation as an example to the kind of cultural changes with the lunch and learns, it seems like the important players there are people who are involved in the hiring process. So I wonder whether, and also there is a problem with this sort of lunch and learn session, that the people that go along, for example, to understanding the menopause, that they're more likely to be women, but what we really need men to understand the menopause better. The people that go along to an LGBT lunch and learn may well already be kind of well versed in those issues. Some of them might be completely new, but I wonder what's being done to target these sessions at the groups that probably have the least awareness and the most to gain from them, and also the players that potentially are more likely to be making decisions about employment. Yeah. Sorry, one more thing. Sorry, really quickly. Are the lunch and learn sessions available in some form, like slides or any sort of recorded potential or anything like that afterwards for those that don't want to learn over lunchtime?
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you want me just to start? Shall I start, Gail, and then you can finish? So yes, so your last question, the lunch and learn sessions are recorded and then available for staff on the intranet. We also do a series of sessions, what we call our leadership conversations as well. And that is for everybody that manages staff within the organisation. So that is more targeted. And of course, the training that we've already started and have got planned will be targeted specifically at managers. And so it won't be something that people elect to do. It'll be something that is mandated for people to attend. Does that answer your question? Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Gail.
So if I, just in terms of the hiring process, we are planning training for managers, but also looking at how the process around recruitment, so the more mechanical aspects, can be more inclusive as well. Just in response to the second question around the lunch and learns, you're absolutely right in that people who are already engaged come along to those sessions. But we also have senior managers attend the sessions. Some of the things that we've seen are that individuals who attend those sessions, so for example, last week when we were doing Islamophobia, they can be quite powerful because so individuals then take away a feeling that they're important in the organisation and they matter. And what happens is people will go along to their teams or their management team meetings and talk about the lunch and learn. And also what happens is a knock-on effect is that Sobia Afridi, our diversity and inclusion specialist, has been invited to attend management team meetings to talk about some of these issues. So it is having a knock-on effect across the organisation, which is very positive. We don't actually record every single lunch and learn because when we've got individuals, employees who are not used to speaking publicly, it makes them feel less comfortable if they're also being recorded. So sometimes we choose not to record, but slides are always shared and available.
Thanks. That's really useful. Are you happy with those responses? Okay, in that case, let's go on to some other questions. Ajaz, and then do we want to have, I think, Chris Mountain, if you both go straight after each other.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Chapman and Helen. Chris kind of asked most of my questions. so there's 15% target, and I know we're just at that target or just below it. How was that set? And then also, Nigel, you spoke about the new census and then said that it'll take 2-3 years to develop that. Why do you think it will take that long when you know the figures are there? So that's two. And I mentioned about the two hijabis that spoke and made a video and stuff, which is really good for them. But how do you think that relates, or how do you envisage that helps with recruitment from the public in itself? And also, just to pick on the Muslim issue again, how do you know that the Muslim population, and I know that you was talking generally, but that academically don't quite have the education background, or they're not as educated for whatever reason than everybody else, in particular within the BAME community. Yeah, and also with the new starters, you said 44% haven't declared, but that sort of only kind of equates to about 30 people, is that right? So I just wanted to make sure that you know, out of 700, so I think that might be a little bit, not misleading, but the 44% seems high that they haven't declared. And why do you think they haven't declared?
Shall I refrain from piling on at this point?
Yeah, go ahead, Nigel.
Yeah, so maybe I could deal with the last. Sorry, I can't read my writing about. What was the third question you asked? Sorry, I've got terrible writing, even worse than the doctors. Yeah, I'm fine with the first and second one. The first two questions. The third one was.
Was it the hijabis?
No, that was no.
Percentage of new starters that haven't declared.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. But yeah, I think you slightly misunderstood my answer when I talked about the sort of numbers before. I'm not saying it's going to take 2 or 3 years to develop targets. I'm saying it's going to be incremental improvement over a number of years. We'll have the targets within a few months, so we need to respond to the census. And also, this is part of the corporate strategy of the organisation. So we won't be waiting. You know, the corporate strategy will be published, I'd say 2 or 3 months' time for the start of the new municipal year. And the targets around this will be in as part of that. So we won't be, you know, dragging our feet about that. The second issue about education, I wasn't saying that Muslims were, you know, worse educated or better educated than anybody else. What I was saying was that in the economically active population of Oxford, something like 20% of that economically active population has broadly poor qualifications. So poor qualifications around numeracy and literacy in particular, and computer skills and digital, which obviously if you're working in an environment like this, which is, you know, largely back office, policy related, specialist skills around legal, planning, etc., if you don't have the core digital literacy skills, it's going to be very hard for you to compete with it for a job. That's just a fact. And that is you know, it's linked to poverty in parts of our city, as you know, Ajaz, and it's you know, it's frankly a failing of our educational system over a long period of time, and it's a limit to what we can actually do about it as a council, because obviously we can't employ people who just don't have the core skills to do even the most, you know, junior job in the organisation, because other than through apprenticeships where we can bring people in, and we do over a long period of time, but even then, you know, if you leave school at 16 without a core understanding of maths and English, it's really, really hard to get a job in an environment like this. It's just a fact.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. The reason I asked it within the ethnic groups was because the insinuation was when Chris answered the question, or asked the question, sorry, you answered, and you said that 20% had come, and I took it as a suggestion that the BAME population was less educated, hence why we're not reaching the targets that we set.
No, that was with respect, that's a misinterpretation. I said 20% of the whole population of all the economically active in the city, which includes white people, BAME, and everybody else. Okay.
Helen, I was just aware we've got quite a lot of questions, but if you've got something you definitely need to ask.
Yes, okay, thank you. So starting with your first question, Councillor Raymond, around how is the new census going to impact on the aspirations that we've got within our workforce. We're currently reviewing what that should look like, but naturally the new census, I'm sure you're aware, is presently showing that 27% of the population that's economically active come from minority ethnic groups, and so we need to reflect that in our target. We will be proposing to increase that, but we just need to be realistic given that turnover is somewhere between, at the moment, 9 and 10%. So I think we just need to make sure that we're setting that right level of expectation. So that's really what we're looking at the moment. And obviously there is a lot of competition for jobs at the moment as well, which, you know, we're in the mix with every other employer as well. You also asked, how do we think the Lunch and Learns help with recruitment? I think it's part of the picture. So I mean, I think there is something about making sure that we're setting a culture where it's quite clear that we're inclusive, and that we're trying to reflect that culture within our workforce, and create a culture where everyone's got an opportunity to progress. And then I think there's something about when people talk outside of the local authority and say, yeah, that's a realistic place to work. They're accepting, there's a great feeling of belonging. And then there is something, again, which goes back to the other councillor's question, that when people look at us, they see themselves in as represented in the community. So I think it's part of the solution, but it's not just that one silver bullet. And then I think your last question was around, you know, what do we think some of the issues were, why some of the new starters aren't declaring? We've got a number of routes to market at the moment. So we have jobs that we advertise on our website, etc. And we have other roles that come through different agencies, and we need to be smarter and make sure that we're embracing that in our data collection process as well. But there is clearly, when people don't want to tell us, that's a trust issue. And I think that we acknowledge that. And Gail mentioned in her intro that 12 months ago, we reached out to the workforce population, wanting people to be part of our minority ethnic network. And we hit nothing, you know, nobody wanted to engage. And I think it shows the value of trying to build up that trust and confidence with some of the conversations that we're having. Now we've got people who think, well, okay, now I could be part of a network, but it shows it is built on trust, and it's not a quick fix, unfortunately. So I don't know if that partly explains some of the questions. I don't know, Gail, if you want to add anything.
Just on the last question, that 44%, it's 44% of new starters in the last 12 months. So that's 43 people out of 98 new starters. It's not total workforce. And just on the Lunch and Learns, it's not just about recruitment. It's also about retaining the people that we've got and improving understanding across the whole organisation.
I'm going to move us on just because there's quite a lot of people who want to ask questions. So I think it's Chris S and then James, if you two go first, and then Alex and Altaf, you go after.
Thank you. Two questions from me. One is, you mentioned in point 10, the key achievements, introducing trans and non-binary options for personal data. Is that literal, as in there are now 4 checkboxes which say male, female, trans and non-binary, or do you mean that there is a variety of options being offered? You also mentioned later on in the report that for applicants, it's male, female, or preferred not to say. Is there a reason not to offer them the ability to declare a different gender if they wish to? And then completely unrelatedly, we measure a lot of recruitment metrics about various personal attributes and recruitment. Do we do anything similar when it comes to retention, advancement, and promotion to see whether those processes are also sort of helping people to ideally stay and advance their career?
And James?
Now you have great data about things like gender pay gaps and so on. Thank you very much. I wonder, you compare it with national data, which is not specific for local authorities. I wonder, do we have, I don't know if we're unusual in having it in this form, but do we have comparative data, first of all, for our two big council-owned companies? And then do we have it for other councils? And maybe one would need to distinguish district from county councils. Thank you.
Nigel or officers, answer in whatever order you prefer.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave Gail to answer the questions that you've got specifically, that's all right, around what's on the forms. But in terms of what other feedback are we getting from existing employees? So I think the staff survey goes quite a way towards that. So the staff survey trickles down into each team, and issues there get manifested and actions get designed that are specific to those areas. One area that I can talk about, for example, in ICT, we've had feedback around people wanting to be able to advance and us to be able to grow our own, and we've specifically responded to that, for example. And I know that in other parts of the business, we've got apprenticeships and so forth that have been direct response to that. And the other thing I would say, which is unfortunately probably too late for some of the employees that are affected, but we do obviously have an exit survey that we reference to make sure that we're picking up feedback from that avenue as well. Gail, would you like to respond on the points that Councillor Smelton had on
So we've got 4 options now. So male, female, trans, non-binary. This is something that we've implemented in the last few months. So wasn't in place in March 23 when this data was taken. So next year, we may have some data, although I suspect numbers will be small and we may not want to report on that data. So we've got one source of collecting the data through our HR system. You have just made me think, though, that we need to check how we determine biological sex, because we need that for HMRC. So I probably just need to check on that. In terms of retention, advancement, promotion, at the moment, we're not recording, we're not monitoring those processes in terms of, you know, how individuals are succeeding. Maybe that's something we can do in the future. I don't think we've got the capability of doing that at the moment, unless it's covered by ordinary recruitment processes, because jobs are advertised internally as well as externally. And in terms of the data, we haven't benchmarked against local authority data or ODS or OX places included in our data. And we haven't benchmarked against Oxfordshire County. That's perhaps something that we could look at, but we don't do it at the moment.
Thanks. Did you have anything to add, Nigel, or are you happy if we move on?
No, I see we've got some data around the mean gender pay gap against Cambridge City Council and Reading Borough Council, where their gap is smaller than ours. But you're right, we don't have the county. On ODS, they're obviously working on the same timetable. So I don't want to make up the answer. I remember reading something about it, but I don't want to make it up here without checking it. So may I make a suggestion, maybe at the shareholder meeting, which is coming up this Thursday, somebody might want to ask about that, because that'd be a good forum to ask, and then we can bring you the answer about what their gender pay gap is.
Yeah, excellent. I think Alex and then Altaf, if you just go straight after each other.
It's a comment and then a question stemming from the comment. Okay. Now Chris is me. This is quite disconcerting, but anyway, there we go. We'll roll with it. The comment was about we've got a lot of quantitative data here, but you can rapidly see the weaknesses in quantitative data, because the drop in appointments from BAME backgrounds from 21 to 14%, taking into account there's 44% non-declaration, is 3 people. So, you know, that's statistically not wholly reliable. I think I'd be interested more in another statistic, which is what's the definition of economically active population? I see elsewhere it excludes students, which is logical, but what does it include and exclude? Is it people who are in work and seeking work? Does it include people who are not seeking work but are of the right age, or what? So that would be helpful. So my question is a kind of qualitative data research question, which picked up to some extent when talking about exit interviews. The non-recruited people, what research are you doing with the appointers and the non-appointed, as it were, to try and identify what the potential issues are there? Are we advertising jobs in such a way that people who aren't suitable applicants are applying? Is that the issue? Is there a different issue about which Chris's question was getting at? Is it, you know, something around the appointment process or what? So what's the kind of qualitative feedback we've got on that?
Just two, I think, 2 questions. Economically active, what's an economically active, and
and
the appointment process, and what do we know about
research on the appointment process?
Gail, do you want to answer on the economically active definition?
So I'm not an expert, but my understanding is that it's people who are either in employment or actively seeking employment, and people outside of the workforce are not included. So people who are not looking for work or have retired. So that's my understanding. I'd have to check with our census experts to get a proper definition.
And on the throughput, so we are being quite challenging of ourselves when we are going out to advert. So we're critically examining what our job descriptions say to make sure that we're not asking for qualifications, for example, when we don't need them. So I think that the non-recruitment, I think one thing that we could do is actually maybe survey people that aren't successful to see how they feel. That I think that would be a really good qualitative measure. Given that we're getting the increased number of applicants, I think that I would suggest that might be something useful that we could do. I don't know how Gail feels about that.
Yeah, that sounds like it could be a recommendation.
I'm not sure my team has the capacity to survey unsuccessful applicants or candidates. We could do some, I can have a think about it, but in terms of surveying all candidates, I just think it's probably not feasible. Our focus in terms of this is to look at inclusive recruitment practices and so that we've got managers who are committed to doing the right thing and removing as much bias as possible from selection processes. So that's our primary objective around, or part of our plan in terms of addressing this. But we don't have any qualitative data at the moment.
Well, maybe we can make it as a recommendation and Cabinet can decide if they want to agree it or not. I think Altaf, and then we should move on to recommendations.
Okay, I think Nigel, you said there's not much change from previous year, and it seems just a slightly percentage hitting to 14%. And you talk about economically active 20%, but we still target 15%, where the general population is about 33% from the ethnic minorities. And the figure also, I think it shows here, the most numbers are in lower or middle lower. So the most people from the ethnicities make up from the numbers are the lower end of the sort of grading than And some of the, if you see in the grading, some places you don't have anybody in grade 10 and grade 11 or the service manager. So the majorities are in lower end. So is there any reason why they can't move up into the grades and most numbers are just in the lower grade working? And my other or the last, I would say, the question is, I know we had headline this evening that there were two hijabis working and Islamic phobia talk or week, whatever. But there are some very, very basic things which I'm sure, Nigel, you worked for BBC World Services and everywhere. So you don't need to lesson to understand this. There are very basic things for Muslim communities to be welcoming in like a town hall in this organization. And with the previous chief executive, when I was Lord Mayor, I did speak and ask. There are some facilities. Say, for example, if somebody wants to have a prayer room and the prayer mat, I left it here. And still, I have been told a number of people are complaining when they come. How do you, welcome? And I have previously said, rather than comparing with Cambridge or some other, just compare with Slough, which is nearby, Luton, where there's high proportions of the Muslim community and they are working, they are in democratic people elected as well. So how do they increase the number? How do they do that? How do they welcoming the communities like their facilities and the basic things they need and require? So I don't think, to be honest, that basic things are still meet, and I can talk to you about the need of some people's. And I'm very less time here, only comes for 2 or 3 meetings. So the people who come here for 6, 7 or 8 hours to work, they would need that facilities, even if there are more people working from home, but still as an organization in this place must be seen welcoming and open and providing those facilities. So I think I did said in the past, when I first elected, I invited somebody from community to the one of the event, and that person said, I lived in this city for 40 years and I didn't know this place inside. So, this is how still people feel, and this is the number I've told you, and I think the Muslim community needs some basic things which we need to discuss and move forward.
Well, on the last point, I'd be very pleased to take your advice about that, Altaf. In terms of core facilities, I think we need to go and look and talk to you about it again and make sure we're absolutely doing all we can to make it a welcoming and building a welcoming environment physically as well as culturally, if you like, and socially. Just going back to your first question about this issue about retention and nurturing, which actually I think Chris also asked actually, and I didn't answer it, so I'll take the opportunity to answer it again now. I've always felt that that some of the hardest things about diversifying your workforce is getting people in through the door in the first place, getting to join you. And they may well have a perception that it's not a particularly welcoming environment. So once they're with you and you work so hard to persuade them to come and work for you, you then need to nurture that talent and bring it up the ranks in terms of seniority, management, and opportunity, which is why the positive action work that Gail and Helen talked about earlier on is so important, and why I've insisted that we did not propose any cuts in the budget for next year in this area, because we need to keep ring-fenced money for that activity, in my view. It's really important, because it takes time to grow out of your workforce the middle managers and the senior leaders of the future, but it's usually easier to do that than attract them from outside, because everybody wants them. So there's a massive competition going on for ethnic minority, local government, senior management at the moment, right across the country, and definitely in the southeast. So it would be better for us to, as it were, grow our own and nurture them and keep them in the place rather than have them leave. The other point you pointed was the high proportion of staff who are in relatively low graded jobs. I think that's a good observation. And one of the risks we run there is that they're in the sort of jobs where they could get the equivalent job outside. So we run a risk that if we don't nurture and develop them, they will go off and work for somebody else, some other organization. And therefore, that's why you want to have your bands of management and middle management and most junior posts reflected diversity right up from the top to the bottom and the bottom to the top, not just in the bottom groups. That's not what you want. And I think, again, it's a bit of a catch-22 because the more people you have in ethnic minorities in senior and middle management roles, the more there is a visibility. There is a sense that I can get on in this organization if I stay and work here. I will be looked after. I'll get an opportunity to progress. So it's a bit of a catch-22. If you don't have that, then people look around and say, well, what's the long-term future of me if I'm going to work here? I might as well go somewhere else to get advancement, which is the last thing you want when you've worked very hard to persuade them into the organization in the first place. So that's the way I see that. And this is why developing the skills and the experience of in middle management of all of those from protected characteristics, that they're well represented, is so important. I think we've done pretty well, frankly, with women, but the other groups were not there where we need to be.
Thanks. I'm going to move us on to recommendations. I think just because of time, there's been a few so far. So one was about the recommendation that we could survey people who weren't recruited in terms of qualities issues that might have faced. Alex?
It was also their appointing managers as to why they hadn't appointed them. So that might address some of the concerns expressed by Gail.
Yeah, maybe to survey the people themselves and or their appointing managers. Are there recommendations from other people? Chris, got Chris there first, and then Ajaz, and then Chris. Yeah.
A simple one and a complicated one. The simple one would be if you're asking people for their gender identity, I would recommend, rather than having a box labeled transgender, it might be better. Also, this is the language that the government's LGBT survey used, was that there's a box for a to identify as a trans woman and a box to identify as a trans man. It could also obviously be executed by being able to tick multiple boxes, but I thought it would be better. It's just going to be more common for if a person wishes to openly declare a trans identity to identify themselves as a trans woman or as a trans man, rather than just trans full stop. There's also, on their survey, they used a lot of synonyms for non-binary. It's obviously, there are more. So there's a question of when you stop. They used non-binary / genderqueer / agender / gender fluid. Your thesaurus will furnish you with more. So there is obviously a question as to how many synonyms to list there. But the transgender box becoming 2 boxes, I think, would be a good thing if the committee is so minded. And then the complicated one is, I suppose the recommendation would be to look at, because it is difficult and acknowledging that it is very difficult, whether it is possible to analyze any relationship between protected characteristics and your trajectory within the organization, in terms of, do you advance to higher grades? How long do you remain at the organization for? Acknowledging the fact that your age correlates the length of time you stay in a job, and your gender correlates the length of time that you stay in a job, regardless of how well the organization treats you, and yada yada yada. These are things that exist outside the council as well. So it's very difficult to get it right, but we may wish to have a go. It's really all I'm trying to get across in the recommendation.
Yeah, that was that final one. Something of sort of like consider whether we can map the trajectory of staff within the organisation with protected characteristics. Is there any?
Over time. Is it over time? Yeah.
Yes,
Sorry.
I think so.
Sorry, I mean, I've been pondering on it for a minute, and it's basically, if we went back 10 years and looked at this data and then 5 years, if it's not moved, that's a problem. If what we've got is a lot of people who had only just been recruited in lower grades and are moving up, then that's better. Not good necessarily, but better. I think that was the...
I think that the simplest version I could think of that would be meaningful was a 3D plot, which immediately indicates you're in trouble, which would look something like grade versus age versus some characteristic you wish to characterize, whether we're materially treating differently on the z-axis. Yeah, it's difficult.
I think Alice has got wording there that she can work with, unless there's any objections. Ajaz?
This is my first one, so I'll say what I want to say, and then if it's not in the right words, help. So we've got a 15% target for BAME communities as an overall target. It strikes me that we're never going to get there at the rate that we're going, because we retain staff so well. So I would suggest that we had such a high rate of new recruits being from ethnic backgrounds, you know, something like 30, 40, 50, 60%, and then over a period much quicker, you'll get to a more balanced workforce. I don't know if that's allowed or if that's positive discrimination or what, but something like that's what I'm trying to recommend, if that makes sense. I think it makes sense.
To have the target be, sorry, can you?
Oh, so so if we have a target of 15% of our workforce to be from ethnic minorities, if we had a target of a percentage a lot higher than that of new recruits to try to hasten the
I think that makes sense. Yeah. Any objections to having that as a recommendation, Alta?
Yeah, no objection, but I would say that we talked about the Muslim group as underrepresented or less, so we'd like to make the recommendation that we look at the cultural and the physical, the barriers, what are they? So I think something on those lines.
Maybe there's one that's on Ajaz's point, and then another one, which I scribbled down, something about assess the facilities provided for Muslim employees.
Yeah.
And whether improvements need to be made. It's two separate ones, yeah? Okay, Chris.
So just quickly on that last one, I think for me, it possibly needs to be broader than just assessing the facilities for Muslim employees, but a broader piece of work looking at, because we've asked about why there's no representation of Muslims today, and the response was we don't know. So I think there needs to be a broader piece of work looking at that as a bespoke issue more generally about the experience of Muslim staff and why there is where the barriers to recruitment and retention are amongst that group beyond just facilities. Is that okay?
I think that, Alice, does that make
amendment to a recommendation?
Okay.
Cool. I had two other recommendations, if that's okay, sorry. And they may not be recommendations depending on the response, but I think I heard in one of the responses that we don't currently collect E&D data when we're taking applications via CV rather than application. So I guess to me, there's a relatively simple recommendation there that we do collect that data in all forms of when we're hiring, because I don't see what the distinction should be there. And the second recommendation was, I think as well, there was a suggestion that we don't currently anonymize applications. I think that's pretty standard practice now in most forms of employment that we anonymize applications. So a recommendation that we move towards that as well where possible.
Yeah, is everyone happy with those two? Okay. Yeah, do you want to run through that?
Yes. So I've got a recommendation around surveying people who are not recruited to around equalities issues, and again the same with the appointing managers as to why they didn't recruit. For gender identity, having a box for trans man and trans woman rather than just trans more generally. Looking at whether it's possible to analyse the relationship between a protected characteristic and their career trajectory over time, and I'll finesse that wording later. And then setting a higher target for ethnic minority representation to sort of increase the pace of recruitment in those groups. And a broader recommendation around looking at why we have underrepresentation in Muslim staff, and then the barriers to recruitment and retention around that. Collecting EDI data when applications are done by CV, and anonymising applications. That's what I've got.
I feel like we've given people lots to go away and look at. So yes, Nigel.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a very good discussion and some very good concrete suggestions there. I just have to manage expectations a little bit here, in the sense that the HR team people team is pretty stretched. It's quite small. And some of this I suspect will need specialist help and support to do, which costs money, because it can't be just done within the team. So, you know, some of the analysis around how Muslims feel about the council, its brand, working here, the facilities, that's quite a big thing to undertake. So we'll go away and think about it. It may need to be paced. I mean, to do all this in 1 year with the resources we've got, I'm not sure that's going to be feasible. So we may have to be a bit more selective, but we'll give you our more considered response when we read it. But they're all very good ideas. It's just resourcing in the end, to some extent.
Yeah, we'll make the recommendations and then you can all decide what you want to come back with. Yeah. Well, thank you, Nigel and officers. I think, Nigel, you're staying for the next item. But yes, officers, thanks for all of your input. And yeah, thanks, Gail, online. So the next item is the review of glyphosate use by ODS. We've got Nigel and also Tina Mould and Laura Harlock, who are both online. Whenever you're ready, Nigel, please do go ahead.
It's good to be joined by Tina and by Laura. Laura obviously works in ODS and actually runs the teams and the subcontracting of the actual application of glyphosates. And Tina is one of our specialists inside the council on biodiversity and can kind of create the client side view, if you like, of the story. The chair has asked me quite often in the council about this issue. And so I promised, I suppose about 9 months ago, it would be maybe a bit longer, to undertake a thorough review of it. Because to be honest, when we've been asked about it in the past, we've been saying things like, well, it's perfectly legally okay to do it, so, you know, we're doing it. And I think we owed you something a bit more thorough. So I hope you feel you've got something a bit more thorough now, because they've spent a lot of time working and analysing the issue. It's been a thorough review. And to be honest, I came to it as the cabinet member with an open mind, because I didn't really understand all the background to it. And if we could have found cost-effective and efficient ways of dealing with weeds on hard surfaces in the city, I would have been the first to say, hallelujah. But the truth is, when you look at the story, the costs and the effectiveness of alternatives is much more suboptimal, frankly, than the use of glyphosate-based weed killer. The second thing I'd say is that it is used sparingly in the city. I mean, we don't go around, you know, I think some people had the impression we sort of went around just spraying it everywhere and, you know, we didn't really care what happened. Far from it, actually. I think ODS is very careful about it, and it only uses it on hard surfaces, pavements, tennis courts, areas like that, where, you know, when you walk around, how hard it is to tackle those weeds through any other method. I mean, there are councils who've tried to go down a purely people-based solution, which is to employ a lot more people to do it. I don't think that's simply just not affordable to us in our current financial situation. So then you've looked at alternatives around acetic acid-based weed killers, which have their own ups and downs. They aren't as effective, and they're also more expensive. So I think the report is a thorough one. And the final issue is, of course, that there are certain species of plant that are invasive, like Japanese knotweed, where there really is just no alternative to using this type of weed killer to tackle them. But I do think they do it carefully. I think they do it directing the spray at the leaves. Where there are leaves, no leaves to direct the spray, they don't do it. And obviously when it's, you know, windy, they don't do it then, because the spray can blow into places you don't particularly want. So I think they're doing all the right things here. And, you know, when I look at the story of York and Bristol and some of the other local authorities who went down the same road with the same kind of good intentions, I noticed that they reined back pretty fast, actually, because they found that, you know, the alternatives just weren't effective. And in the case of, I think it was Brighton I was reading about, where they really did back off using it on pavements and hard surfaces. They had all sorts of issues about the surfaces, and a spate of claims from people who were, you know, injured because of the issues that arose from that. And, you know, one of the things my constituents were saying to me at the weekend is the state of our pavements is pretty bad, and the state of our potholes is pretty bad. And I don't think they would welcome if I were to bring in a maintenance regime across the city, which was likely to exacerbate those problems. I think for all those reasons, I think it's a thorough report, and we're going to have to hold the status quo, at least for now, until there are good alternatives and or if the regulatory position changes.
Thanks. I'm just going to add that this isn't just here because I keep hassling Nigel about it. It's because it couldn't go on climate environment panel. Also, do officers want to add anything at this point? No. No. In that case, have we got any questions? Chris S, then Alex.
A question and probably a recommendation off the back of it. Is there appetite where, if there are local groups that already do things like sort of tend to street trees in their area, things like that sort, if they were minded to do some volunteer activity in their area, to communicate with them and essentially work alongside them? I suppose that would probably look something like there being a mailing list of interested parties who are told, here is when your area would ordinarily be treated, and therefore groups wishing to do their own activity should sort of work with that schedule, if you like. It seems like the kind of thing where maybe parishes might get involved. I know some individual streets that have groups that already do things like tree care might potentially wish to do such a thing, and it's presumably low cost for there to be a mailing list that you can sign up to, where what work is expected to be done in what places would be distributed.
Alex, was that something to come in straight away on?
Yeah, it's kind of related.
Yeah.
So my 2 points now. Point number one was when the report was written, the EU hadn't decided what it's doing. The EU has now extended the license for glyphosate for 10 years because it regards it as a legitimate thing to do, and is in terms of weed killers, weed killers are things you should use very sparingly, and you want ones which degrade quickly. This one can be used sparingly and degrades very quickly. So I would recommend we approve the proposals that the Cabinet is making, which I think is probably just not making a recommendation from scrutiny. On Chris's recommendation, I think we just need to differentiate, this was my point here, differentiate between where, and I've got a road in my patch, or a number of areas in my patch where there are community gardening groups who have planted plants along areas which are adjacent to the public highway, and by agreement with ODS and the council, those areas are approached with caution when spraying. So you don't get a blanket spray down the entire roadway. You wouldn't go near that particular bit. That is not the same as a kind of ward-based opt-out of a maintenance regime. And I think we need to differentiate between the two things. I think where there is a gardening group and where an operative might need just to be advised that something is a plant that is meant to be there and is not a weed. If it's not causing a problem, that's fine. And a kind of, well, we just don't want it in road X, because that I think is inappropriate, and we're going to end up with all sorts of trouble if we have that.
Absolutely. To be clear, I certainly didn't envisage it being like an opt-out for an area, but more a case of, if you know that treatment would take place on March 1st, for example, then that means if you are a community group, you would be well advised to schedule a session on Feb the 15th, such that anybody particularly wishing to make sure that something is properly marked, that it shouldn't be sprayed or something like that, or indeed to do whatever volunteer activity they want to do to reduce the need for any sort of weed control, then it allows them to sync up. I think that's all it is.
Was that all of your questions from both of you?
I thought Councillor Hollingsworth's intervention was very helpful there. And the question's a good question. The only caveat I would put is that we have to maintain standards here. We have hard surfaces where weeds are quite difficult to get rid of. And while I have been talking to Labour county councils about the concept of a sort of adopt your area, and maybe even trying to get some funding from the county to do that, we do have to maintain a minimum level of standards. So, if they adopt an area, they want to look after it themselves, that's fine, that's great. But and if they want to use a lot of, manual intervention to do so, that's great. But at the end of the day, we've still got to rid ourselves of these weeds where they're causing a public nuisance and a problem and damaging the public realm. And that would have to be part of the sort of concordat or agreement we had with them. And if that meant they had to use glyphosate to do it, but nothing else was going to work, then that would have to be the situation.
Ajaz has a question, but I thought whilst we're on the topic, I'd ask about the fact that we've said there are some like wards and areas that have currently opted out through whatever mechanism that was that they were able to do that. And there's nothing in here about how it will be communicated to those areas that glyphosate will now be used there. And yeah, there might, if they went to the effort of opting out, there's likely to be objection from them, and what the process is going to be for communicating with that and dealing with anything that comes back from it.
I don't know the dim and distant history of how people had an opt-out, other than no doubt shouting loudly, using their influence where they could. But I think you make a very good point about communicating. I mean, obviously councillors are aware now. There's a very small number of councillors who would be affected by this, but they are aware of this paper, they're aware of this proposed policy, and it not having opt-outs, to use the phrase we've used earlier on. So we'll have to communicate with local groups in those areas through their councillors, and other ways too. It's a relatively small challenge, to be honest, because there aren't many areas where there is opt-out going on at the moment.
Ajaz and then Chris, if you just go one after the other.
Chaotic. Could become a bit chaotic, I think, that one. But you know, when they do go and use to clear the weeds, if there's no weeds there, surely then they don't use anything.
That's correct, yeah.
So therefore, if somebody was looking after their road or their patch, it would be clear. It would be clear. So maybe we could have a citywide sort of timetable when you're going to go around, and then people that are interested, they could look at it, and then if the road was clear, then surely would use it, so everybody would be happy.
Well, I'm sure ODS would. I'm sure Laura would like to come in on that, because she's actually in charge of the timetable and knows it intimately well. And I think what you're basically saying is there needs to be proper communication between those groups who adopt an area and the timetable, and make sure it all works properly together. Laura?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how it currently works now, while yes, we say we have 3 treatments a year, it's obviously dictated to by the weather. So if it's, you know, raining, or when we've planned in, or there's particularly strong winds on a day, we won't necessarily, while we could say, you know, 1st of May we're gonna carry out the treatment, and it's going to take the next 2 to 3 weeks across the city. It may then change, because obviously weather conditions change, and it's quite a tight regulations around the kind of weather conditions in which we can spray and treat the weeds that are there. So all we can really advise is we're looking to carry out a treatment within these months, and then, as you say, we could communicate that, and through feedback from residents and councillors, if all are agreed, we would need like a list of the roads for us to pass on to our contractor, just to make them aware of what they need to miss, essentially. Or if the residents were to kind of manually weed the streets.
Thanks, that's useful to hear. Chris, did you want to do your question or not?
So it was just a follow-up really to the point about the areas that currently are, for whatever reasons, being exempt from glyphosate use. Do we know where they are, and can that list be published? Because I feel like it's all well and good to say councillors can communicate with their communities that it was being used, but if we didn't know that it wasn't being used in our patch in the first place, that would be, I don't know. I guess it would just be good to know exactly where was exempt previously and where is now going to be not exempt.
That's a recommendation you wish to make, then I'm sure we can meet that. I don't have the list in front of me at the moment, and I don't want to ask Laura to comment on a list if she hasn't got it too. I think she should, but the point is that we're happy to share the list, and happy, most importantly, that the councillors work with us to communicate the fact that you know, we don't have an opt-out policy in respect of this.
Yeah, I feel like that maybe we can return to that in recommendations. And I don't have a questions for people, or if not, I might ask. I've got a couple. One was just around whether it was considered, obviously that there's increased costs for alternative methods. A lot of people suggest that where you can offset that is by sharing equipment with neighbouring councils or buying equipment from the council, which you then pay other organisations to use, who might also be interested in maintaining their land without using things like glyphosate. Was that an option that was considered in this study or not? And then the other sort of point I just wanted to raise was I feel like this language that gets used about it not being used in parks has being slightly confusing, because we talk about it, it's not used in parks, but it is used on tennis courts, which quite often in parks. It I think perhaps be useful to get clarity on whether it is or isn't used in parks if we're including tennis courts within them.
Well, on the latter point, I have tried to be clearer in the communication, in the briefing we put out last week. We were quite clear about it, actually, that the tennis courts were sometimes in parks, and therefore we couldn't say it was never used in parks. So I think we've dealt with that matter. The issue about the equipment, that's part of the cost, but the real cost, the driving cost, is people. And that is what makes it so prohibitive to go to a non-chemical based solution of any kind. But I'm sure, I mean, I don't know how many more people. I mean, I noticed, I think it was in Hounslow or somewhere else, they recruited something like 25 people over the summer to dispense with using any sort of chemical weed killers. Well, I mean, that's a massive bill. I imagine, what that would be at a time when we are very, as you know, all very in a very tight financial position going to the budget round. So I don't think that's really realistic. I mean, obviously it's up to political parties can put forward a budget proposal if they want to, but in the context of our finances, I think it's quite a stretch to ask for significant investment in people. So even if you could solve the equipment problem, you wouldn't be able to solve the people problem, which would allow them to use the equipment, which would make the thing cost effective. Maybe Laura would like to also come in on that. Or Tina. Sorry, Tina's got a hand up, I see as well.
Just to say that I had a chat with Chris Bell this morning, who's Green Flag Judge, and he really said to me really clearly, and Laura may all probably agree with me, and I used to work in parks, that there's nothing out there that really works. And so you can try and put loads of people, or you can try and use other bits and pieces, but they just don't work. So that's the reality of the situation. That's why we carry on using glyphosate. There isn't really other methodologies that are going to do the job in the same way. So I just thought I'd throw that in, because that's why we're doing this in that way.
Thanks. Are there any other questions, or perhaps we should go to recommendations? In which case, I think there's the recommendation on gardening groups and community groups. Yeah, is everyone happy with that one? And are you able to do some wording? Excellent.
Is that the one that there's a way for them to sort of register to be communicated with, basically?
Yes, so that people's plants don't get killed, etc. Yeah. And then it sounds like there's a broader one, maybe it's a two-part one around comms with the wards areas that had opt-out. Both, I think it'd be useful to have some more detail on how those people are going to be told, both through, and also some communication with councillors about where those areas are, and letting those councillors know if it's in their area, because yeah, like others around the table, I've got no idea what those areas are. Chris.
Sorry, I think it would be useful if it wasn't just, this might be getting into the weeds of it. That was not intentional. That was a Chris Moulton-esque remark. Channeling my inner you. No, I was going to say, I think it'd be useful if it wasn't just, the recommendation isn't just that it's communicated to the ward councillors that it's in, whose patch it's in, but more broadly than that, because obviously the people that are our residents don't just live within the confines of their ward. They do things in other areas, and we'll get questions on that and communicated. So it'd be useful to have it more broad than that. Yes, publishing that list as Nigel suggested.
Yeah, publishing that list and a comms plan for telling people who have particularly been in those areas would also be good. Is there anything else? No. In that case, I think we're all good with that item. Thanks, Nigel, for your mega stint. I think we can move on to our final one. And thank you to officers as well. So final big item is the LGA Corporate Peer Review Council Action Plan. So we've got Susan Brown, Caroline Green and Lucy Cherry. And whenever you're ready, Susan, please do introduce it.
Hi, and thank you very much. And I'll try not to keep you too long. Thanks very much for inviting us. Just to start off with, I mean, thought it just might be helpful to remind people that we asked to have a peer review, an LGA peer review back in the spring, really, this year, nearly last year, but not quite. And that was for several reasons, really. I think it's very important that we try and always learn as an organisation. I think that's something that we've always sought to do. And it's also a useful, effectively, an audit of how we're doing. So you will have received the report, and I think we discussed it previously, and this coming to you today is our response to the report, our action plan. And so I thought it would be helpful to just run through the kind of key points in response to the various different recommendations of the peer review. So the first recommendations in the report relate to the recommendation about convening anchor institutions to address our priorities. Essentially what we're saying in our action plan is we're referring to the fact that we do a lot of work around this area already. And in particular, we are part of many different partnerships which are already trying to work as closely as we possibly can together in order to meet what are our shared objectives, but also the council's objectives in terms of tackling inequalities in our city. Very specifically, it talks about some things that we're doing with Oxwed around skills. It talks about the work that we are doing with the Oxford University Hospitals, and I have to note at this point that my employer is Oxford University Hospitals, and also, and I don't know how I managed to miss this, it's named incorrectly in the report, so I will be making that correction before it goes to cabinet, so apologies for that. We are also working with the Oxfordshire Inclusive Economic Partnership, and in fact we had a very useful meeting very recently of the Oxfordshire Inclusive Economic Partnership, specifically talked about the anchor institutions work that we started doing with Oxford University Hospitals, and I think some of that will be being taken forward via the Oxfordshire Inclusive Economic Partnership, because that is kind of the work that it's already been doing, particularly around skills. We also talked about the delivery plan for the City Centre Action Plan, delivery board for the City Centre Action Plan. I think the future Oxfordshire partnership priorities are very well aligned to the City Council's already, but we are ensuring, not least through the fact that I'm chairing it this year, that we continue to do so. I think there's some very useful work that's now being done through the One Public Estate, particularly around health and City Council. I'm going to try not to cover every single aspect of the action plan, but I actually thought that was a really important one, and so I would cover that one in a bit more detail. Taking the next two together, prioritisation and project management corporate centre, which I think you might summarise really as prioritisation and delivery. I think there's some really important work which we'd sort of identified to the peer review team themselves, that we wanted to make sure that our corporate strategy going forward had much clearer prioritisation in it. We felt that although it was a slimmed down version of the previous version, it still had too much in it, and we really needed to focus our priorities more clearly. Obviously, we are starting now the corporate strategy work, and that's something that will be really key to it, and also the annual business plan. Caroline can talk more, as can Lucy, I'm sure, about the officer boards that are working closely to prioritise better from an officer perspective as well. There's obviously work that's being done around making sure that we've got the right staff in the right place to carry out some of that work as well. In terms of performance management, again, the work on the corporate strategy is very key to this, but there's also some really good new proposals around a new performance dashboard, and technology being used very creatively to develop that. And we're also having some interesting conversations with the two universities about how we can better utilise their expertise in this area. In terms of the next recommendation, which was about better communicating our regeneration work in the city, we're obviously taking part in the process that the County Council are currently carrying out about Oxfordshire Place narrative. And we are also wanting to make sure that going forward we have a really good and strong focus on engagement in regeneration. And one of the things that I think we've done really successfully in the city, and it's been part of the work that we've done with Oxford North, the Westgate, and a number of other big developments, is community employment planning. And that's something that we'll be pushing forward on, and it's obviously was a key part of our local plan as well. So that is a very important part of communication about our regen. I think the next two bullet points are not aligned properly, so I think there's some bullet points which should be attached to the organisational structure, which appear under better communicating regeneration. So again, needs to actually just make sure that that's sorted out before we have a final version. But the organisational structure, we are going to be managing some quite big changes, and that's both around staffing, but also around, we already have, of course, made some quite big changes in terms of people's workspace, both in terms of lots of people working from home, but also people moving from St Aldate's Chambers into the town hall. And frankly, I'd like to thank staff again for the way they managed that so smoothly. I think it was quite amazing, but obviously it was done quite quickly, and there was still some catch-up work to be done on that, both in terms of capital budgets and just sort of practicalities. On hybrid working, I think that was a particular issue that was picked up on, both in terms of support for staff who are working from home, in terms of IT, but also in terms of making sure that people feel supported and feel part of a team and are encouraged to come in for face-to-face meetings on a reasonably regular basis. And that was important. That is all there in the action plan, including more face-to-face meetings with senior officers, the senior management team. In terms of the corporate management team and cabinet, there were a couple of recommendations around more regular meetings. Those are happening. They had just sort of slipped out of the diary for a few months, but they are now back and happening. And then finally, excuse me, on member development, this is one that I think I and a number of others fed in on, basically saying we thought we hadn't quite got this right at the moment. I think one of the things that the peer review picked up was that we have had quite a lot of new members in our cabinet, and that the training was not really as good as it should have been in terms of supporting people in what's can be quite, well, is a big role, and it's complicated to try and understand both the role of a cabinet member and also the whole organisation. So there was two sort of specific recommendations. One was around improving training for cabinet members going forward, and the other was improving the induction training more generally for new members. And again, I think we've had as a council, I think we've had quite a high turnover of councillors really. So I think both of those things are really important, and they are under discussion. Both Caroline and I've had numbers of discussions with different people about this, including the LGA, who, by the way, don't seem to have brilliant training for cabinet members as far as I can see, unfortunately. It would be great if we could just sort of tap into an existing programme that was already there, but doesn't seem to be quite the case. And then the final recommendation in the report, which is addressed in the action plan, is around the Oxford model. I mean, again, I think the peer review was pretty complimentary about our work on the Oxford model, said it's very clear that it allowed us to do a lot of things that otherwise we would not be able to do. And again, sort of reflecting, I think, back to us some of the things that we've been saying to them, was there is work to be done around clienting, which we absolutely agree with, and that's part of the action plan. There is work to describe the Oxford model a bit more clearly, and that is being worked on currently. Again, very much something that we fed into them. It is going to be incredibly important, and we hope we are achieving that in this year's budgets and corporate plans, that it's really important we align the work programmes and budgets of our different companies and the council. And I'll stop there.
Thanks. Caroline or Lucy, did you want to add anything at this point or go straight to questions?
I will keep it very brief because I think Susan's got a good and comprehensive overview. Just a couple of points to pick up on. Susan did mention sort of the prioritisation piece, which I think is fair to say it's probably the thing that we find most challenging. But we have had for the last couple of years been developing some kind of officer structures around kind of corporate boards, which keep an overview of our delivery against our key projects, but also something we call the change front door. We're very conscious that particularly in the IT space, where bringing forward a number of those projects is actually really critical to doing a lot of other things, which is highlighted in the report. We need to manage that really, really carefully. So our change front door process is really about that assessment about if we're taking on something new or something needs to be done, there has to be a discussion about what falls away or where the resources are going to come from. And that's an approach I think we need to be making sure we're building on and being quite robust about where we really can't take on more. I think the other element of their report was really, really complimentary about how ambitious we are, that we have a good track record of financial management and risk management, but a note of concern about really taking on more and more in that space. So you'll see in the action plan, there are some elements where we are saying that we will need some modest but more resources, most of which we hope to be able to capitalise to make sure that we can deliver some of the critical programmes, which are either about changing the way we work to deliver efficiencies or have got income streams attached to them. The only thing I'd want to add at the end there is just also to say that not only the exercise itself, but also putting together this action plan has been really helpful for us all in terms of taking a step back and really reflecting on some of these challenges. And I have to say thank you to Lucy, who managed the whole thing incredibly well, and including getting us to this stage with the action plan. It really wasn't a small feat in any way. Last thing I'd say is that the team are coming back, or some of the team are coming back in April. So I think that's really helpful to keep us focused on delivery of this action plan, which we hope will be agreed by Cabinet.
Thanks. There's a question from Alex. Are there any other questions? And Chris?
Yeah, my question was slightly shot down by Caroline immediately answering it as soon as I put my hand down. So I'll ask a different one if that's all right with you. What I was going to ask is which of these, I'll preface it, the danger with this is got so many actions that we could disappear into the weeds again, using Chris Jay's phrase. The Smoten-esque. Yeah, we might go smotening into the undergrowth. and so on. So I wanted to try and keep it as kind of big strategic questions. So my question originally was which of this is going to be the most difficult? So I'm going to cheat and say what's after the one that you've already answered is the second most difficult, not of the actions, but of the 10 recommendations. So those big, broad brush recommendations, which is it that organisationally, I think I will deliberately ask this of officers, are we going to find most challenging?
Let's take Chris's straight away as well.
Sure, this might be useful because it might be the answer to Alex's question. I've got two questions. I've got a little one and a big one, so I'll ask the little one first. The West End Strategic Board is described as having a remit for the Cowley branch line. I just wondered why that was, because most of its most direct relevance is Littlemore and Lees and Science Park and so on. I was just surprised that the West End Strategic Board has that on its plate and how that came to be. And then the big one is potentially the answer to that question is you mentioned one point there was about stopping projects. And basically sort of recognizing when a project's time has come. And that's one of those things where it is everybody can agree abstractly. Don't commit the sunk cost fallacy. Recognize when a project has had its day and end it promptly and at the proper time. And it's really, really hard to point at an individual project and being like, that has honestly been a waste of time for the past month and should have stopped a month ago. So it's obviously very, very thorny to think of examples of that right now. Are there past examples maybe we can think of where that has happened and we think that sort of could have been handled better in the past is maybe an easier way to ask the question because it's less a case of, asking you to make decisions on the spot about projects that are ongoing right now.
I think one of those was directly to officers, Alex's question, and then the others is maybe broader.
So that's a lesson as to why you should just say, no, the cabinet members covered it, and then just you get all the questions that you can answer. No, I mean, I think undoubtedly, as I said, the prioritisation and capacity to deliver is the biggest challenge. I think a lot of the others, and this was somewhat reassuring, kind of told us stuff that we already know. But the reason they are recommendations is because there's stuff that we do need to do better on. So I'm not being complacent about any of them. I think staying on top of our ICT delivery and making sure that stays on course is a real challenge because I mean, we have got recruitment retention difficulties like a lot of other places in ICT at the moment. And there's a lot of demand coming from the organisation for new systems that will help people work more efficiently and effectively. So I think that remains for us a big challenge. And the other one I would flag, perhaps more in terms of it being really important, rather than I'm not saying it's not challenging, but I think the recommendations around the Oxford model and particularly staying on top of best practice in terms of governance and ensuring we've got the alignment of business plans, but also the alignment of cultures with our companies is really critical. Where that goes wrong is where other councils have experienced challenge in it. So I guess they're the two I would pull out. I'm happy to come back on anything else, but I'll give you first dibs if you like.
Well, rather boringly, I've had exactly the same three as you in terms of the ones that are most challenging. I mean, I think that because they are, I mean, I think they're also, I have to say, I mean, they are things that we reflected to the peer review team. We sort of said, we think we need to prioritise more and we think that we need to get clienting better and we need to make sure that we're all aligned with our companies. So, I mean, it wasn't news, but that they're also there because they are really big challenges and I think they are pretty difficult to do. So, I mean, there's going to have to be a lot of officer and member focus on getting that right. I think you're right, Chris, that one of the really difficult things is stopping projects and knowing when to stop projects and sort of saying, that isn't something that can be delivered. But sometimes and hopefully for a number of our significant projects, that is going to be much more about saying something like, we can't do this now, but we may be able to do it in 2 years' time. We just need to make sure that we're not trying to do 10 things at once. We need to focus on doing 4 things well. And then, you know, we build up our programme of projects so that we're doing things in the right order, and the order of realistic deliverability. You also asked a question about the Oxford West End board and why that has the Cowley branch line as part of it, and it's essentially because the station, the central station, is part of that board's look at the whole of the West End. And obviously the Cowley branch line comes into that, so that end of it relates to that. And obviously it is about the Cowley branch line is not just about the connectivity outwards to the science park and the business park, but it's also about the journey inwards to the city centre. So it does relate as well to the general development of the West End. Hope that answers that point, but Caroline may have more to add on that.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think that part of the point of the West End board, the West End board, is about bringing together the key stakeholders, particularly those with influence and lobbying influence. So not only have the conversations that happened there helped us get secure funding from some of the partners in the city into the feasibility work for the Cowley branch line, but we're also hopeful that some of the people who are on that board who understand and are committed to the Cowley branch line can help us with the lobbying effort. So it's done that. I think on the project stopping, yes, it is hard, and I can think of a number that we might be having conversations about going forward, which is probably not right to say here, but I mean, the example I was going to refer to recently is agreeing to not move forward with the Cave Street project. That then did immediately could turn into a potential opportunity that we might be able to use it in some way to help with our homelessness and housing challenges. So even when we've taken the decision to stop, there's often actually, you know, we recognise that we still need to look at whether it can help us with one of our priorities. So it is a real challenge for us. But perhaps I'll come back with the, I think it's a really real test for us in the conversations we want to have through both the budget, but also the corporate strategy discussions about can we have the right conversations with members about which of these actually we need to put on perhaps a pipeline of schemes rather than immediate one.
I think Ajaz has a question, and then maybe if people want to start thinking about recommendations, unless there's more questions.
Yeah, thank you. That was pretty good, the review overall, I think. And so is this report. And then going on what you said, that instead of doing 10 things, doing 4 things really well, and leading on to what Alex said as well, there seems to be a hell of a lot on there for us to do well. So I don't think, I don't know who's going to do all that well. So maybe we just need to concentrate on some parts of it so we can make it better. I don't know if that's a recommendation as well as a question or observation.
Maybe Imogen, do you want to come straight away?
I've been trying to think about whether this is a question or not, but I think it is just a useful challenge, comment, conversation to start having. I'm really glad that the first recommendation is something I talk about as much as I get the chance to on utilising our anchor institutions. I'm in a university ward, so that will probably be the examples I choose. And it's something I think about a lot, I get challenged about a lot. And the other councils, I think, are doing much better work than us. So it's really amazing that we sort out this process of learning from others. And I think there is a lot of learning, and there are books and books written on it, on harnessing anchor institutions. And there is so much we're doing well. But I think, and I'll take an example from the university and on environment, because those are things that I've been particularly involved with. But something that I don't see enough work on is the fact that scope 3 emissions for us, that, you know, it just kind of trails off into a ... not our problem, are somebody else's scope 1 emissions, and vice versa. And an example would be that Oxford University might be able to report a massive reduction in emissions. And you look into it and you go, oh, it's because everybody's now working from home, which is then our problem, because we see that the worst emissions in the city are from buildings, and it's a retrofit problem. The university has made a massive saving, and that's money that, I mean, if they have a bit of a frank conversation of not just patting themselves on the back, oh, we've done something really good for the environment. Instead of 20 people working in one office, 20 people are in 20 different houses in the city. I think those are difficult conversations. They're frank conversations to have between organisations that have their own priorities and their own image to maintain. But I think that work that is a bit more behind the scenes needs to be really open. We need to be challenging each other. We need to be encouraging those challenges. And I think a really good way of doing that is to set the outcomes, the desirable, like what city do we want to see together? And I definitely think that the university's strategic plan often presents itself as the city is lucky to have us, but doesn't do enough to think about the fact that, you know, Oxford and Cambridge, two most unequal cities in the country, what do they have in common? There is obviously an impact on inequality in a city when you have very long-standing, hundreds of years of land ownership. So I think we need to be having these conversations, joining those dots, especially when it comes to the environment. So I would like to see more of that from ZCOP, from some of those existing structures that we have set in place. But I really hope that first recommendation, I'm glad it's pride of place, can be built into everything we do, into all, you know, that question of how can we be working with our institutions, with hospitals, with schools, all sorts, to reach these common goals, can really be front and foremost of our corporate strategy off the back of this peer review.
Yeah, go ahead, whoever wants to respond.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's a really good challenge, and I think one of the things I would say is that I think there's been a change in leadership both at the University of Oxford and at Oxford University Hospitals. I think both of those have helped a lot in terms of our ability to engage with those anchor institutions. And in many places, it is actually the leading provider health trust that has led on anchor institution work. And there is actually quite a lot of pressure in the NHS to make sure that hospital trusts do that. So it was really pleasing that Oxford University Hospitals did actually lead in terms of trying to pull together people to sort of start having conversations specifically around the kind of terminology of anchor institutions. But I would say that I do think a lot of work has been done, particularly in the last year, actually, over bringing together both universities and other bits of the public sector to really focus on, you know, what are our shared objectives, and to reflect. And I think it's a really important point you made there, Imogen, about what kind of city do we want together, and, you know, what influences are the two universities having on our city, both positive and negative, and how can they help with the positive and help us address the negative. And I mean, clearly those are things around transport, emissions, housing, inequalities, all the things that we talk about all the time in this council, but also building stronger communities. And I think I feel quite encouraged by the conversations that I've been having with the university, and Caroline and I met with Alex Betts again today. We meet with them really regularly. The university are doing a lot of really good work now, and leading on work without us having to sort of like drag them to it. And I think it is extremely encouraging. I think there's often been quite a good, strong relationship actually with Oxford Brookes, who tend to have up until now, I think, being more engaged in terms of the loss of the partnership working. But it is encouraging to see, but there's an awful long way to go. And you're absolutely right. You know, we've got a lot of really big challenges that we need to work on together. And I didn't bring a pen with me to the table, So I'm now, I know what Ejaz was commenting on the number of priorities, which you're absolutely right. I was thinking, as I said, you know, focusing on doing 4 things, there's quite a lot in this action plan. So I think one of the important things will be to make sure that our action plan aligns with our corporate strategy, and that we aren't sort of trying to do too much too soon. But I mean, there are some very specific actions in there which are sort of time deliverable. Some of them are more longer term objectives, but I think there's also some really quite specific actions which we can do and have achieved. So which I think is the key thing in an action plan, is you don't want it to be so strategic that nothing's ever achievable. You want some really keen actions. So thank you, Lucy, for drawing together a really good action plan.
Thanks. Is there anything else? I think we should probably move to recommendations. Have we got, I feel like someone mentioned one earlier that I've now forgotten.
Got the one from sort of engage with anchor institutions and open conversations about sort of city vision.
Yeah.
Make a recommendation out of what I said and agreement with what I said. I don't think. That's the only potential I've got.
Okay, something about ensuring work with anchor institutions is like at the heart of strategies, heart of corporate strategy. Yeah. Yep. Okay, if everyone agrees, that sounds good. Anything else? Alex, you look like you have something, but I don't know, you're just looking at me. Oh, okay. In that case, thank you, Susan, Caroline, Lucy, for sitting through all of this and coming to speak to us this evening. Hopefully we can now whiz through some admin at the end of the agenda. Alice, I'll hand it over to you for the work plan and forward plan.
Thank you. So I'll be quick in the interest of time. So the work plan and the forward plan are included in the agenda pack. The forward plan has been updated today since the agenda was published, and there's a summary on the desk if anyone wants to refer to it. It's one between a few of you rather than one each, so hopefully you can all see one. There has been some report slippage and additional reports put on the forward plan for January Cabinet. So it's recommended that the following Cabinet items are now considered at January scrutiny. So that will be the draft corporate strategy 24 to 28 for consultation, which is already listed on the work plan. The Oxfordshire Food Strategy Action Plan, which again is already listed on the work plan. And then I've had confirmation today that the leisure management contract report should be available in January. So the suggestion is to add that to the forward plan for January scrutiny. There's also the Scrutiny commissioned item on the DAHA accreditation and domestic abuse review group update scheduled for January. And then there'll be a few reports that go to finance and performance panel, the council tax reduction scheme, the integrated performance report for Q4 22-23, and the HRA rent setting report. And that would mean that the following reports aren't considered in January. So that'd be the Bertie Place Affordable Housing Scheme, private rented sector regulation policies, results of consultation and approval, covered market roof refurbishment project, project approvals for 5 small and garage sites to deliver affordable housing, and the Oxlep Strategic Economic Plan. I think I can leave it there and discuss other items at a future meeting.
Is everyone happy to agree that work plan? Great. Next bit is reporting back on our recommendations. So on the 15th of November, Cabinet looked at recommendations we made on grant allocations and on the central conservation area appraisal. We made 2 on each of those and both were agreed, which is lovely. And I'll hand over to Alice for Alex to report back on climate environment panel.
You again. So I'm simply working through them. Apologies. The panel met. We discussed a number of items, made recommendations onto one on biodiversity, one on the issue of retrofit. The wording, I should say that Alice has worked up the wording. The chair, whoever that is, has rather idly not got round to doing it because he's been too busy marking essays. But he will promise. So the main issues around the biodiversity report, I think one snappy one, which is about right tree, right place. We were slightly alarmed to discover, I think a community group planted a load of trees on a park, which is actually one of Oxford's very small areas of peat, which is like the last thing you should be doing there. So there was a kind of a right tree, right thing, right place thing. More importantly, perhaps, but more boringly, we've got some recommendations around the nature of the contracts between the council and parks. There's a lot of expertise which rests in the heads of people working in parks, and whether that would survive the kind of turnover we've maybe been talking about is not clear. So that was quite important. And on retrofit, again, it's around communications. Anyone who's tried to do retrofit, I'd declare an interest. It is a mind-boggling morass of impenetrable jargon and impossible to understand acronyms. We think the council's got to take a really leading role in demystifying it, because frankly, that is such a huge barrier to participation at the moment. People just genuinely don't understand what they should do, and we think that's quite key. But we'll have those written up in due course. Thank you, Chris.
Are there any questions or comments? And if not, if we can all just generally agree that we're happy with those, that would be great. I'm going to take that as a yes. And I will hand over to Alice for the report on standing panels and review group arrangements.
Thank you. Again, I'll try and be as quick as I can. So following recent changes to the political composition of the council, a review of political proportionalities on committees was undertaken, and I'm sure most of you will know that a report went to council in November to agree the new seat allocations. The scrutiny operating principles state that the scrutiny committee can establish standing panels and review groups, and that membership is agreed by the committee rather than full council. So arrangements for the current municipal year were agreed by the Scrutiny Committee in June this year, but following the changes to the political composition of the council, changes are proposed to the political balance and as a result membership of the standing panels and review groups. There are no proposed changes to the name, number, remit or meeting dates of standing panels or review groups as they were agreed for the duration of the current municipal year. Standing panels and review groups are not required by law to reflect the political makeup of the council, but the Scrutiny Committee has in the current and previous years established a cross-party principal guide for appointments to ensure that they remain representative. The cross-party principal guide has been reviewed in line with the council's new political composition. It's recommended that authority is delegated to myself as a scrutiny officer to update the scrutiny operating principles as set out in the report. And that's that members, panels of 4 members will have 1 Labour, 1 Liberal Democrat, 1 Green and 1 Oxford Socialist Independent. And for panels of 6 members, that'll be 2 Labour, 1 Liberal Democrat, 1 Green, 1 Oxford Socialist Independent and 1 Independent group. Given the large number of political groups which now make up the council, it's recommended that standing panels and review groups are comprised of 6 members to ensure true cross-party representation. This is with the caveat that where a political group does not wish to take up their seat allocation on a particular panel or review group, membership may revert to 4 members. It's recommended that where an existing standing panel or review group chair is renominated to sit on their respective panel or review group for this year, that those chairs should continue in their roles for the remainder of this year in the interest of continuity. And should they not be renominated, the committee would need to appoint a new chair. So the nominations made by political groups have been received as follows. So Finance and Performance Panel and by de facto Budget Review Group, because the committee agreed they would have the same membership, is Councillor James Fry in the chair, Councillor Tiago Correis, Councillor Chris Smoten, Councillor Chris Jarvis, Councillor Hosni Jafari Marbini and Councillor Amar Latif. Housing and Homelessness Panel, Councillor Lizzie Diggins in the chair, Councillor Mary Clarkson, Councillor Joe Sanderson, Rosie Raw, Councillor Paula Dunn and Councillor Shyster Aziz. The Climate and Environment Panel, Councillor Alex Hollingsworth in the chair, Councillor James Fry, Councillor Catherine Miles, Councillor Emily Kerr, Councillor Paula Dunn and Councillor Shyster Aziz. For Company Scrutiny Panel, the Oxford Socialist Independence Group did not wish to take up its allocation of a seat, so it's recommended that this panel revert to a membership of 4 members as follows: Councillor Mike Rowley, Councillor Catherine Miles, Councillor Alistair Morris and Councillor Adrius Raymond from the Independent Group, who would be taking the seat which the Oxford Socialist Independence Group did not wish to take up. And it's also recommended that some wording be added to the operating principles to provide clarity on situations where similar situations might occur in future if a group doesn't wish to take up its seats. So please bear with me while I read this out. So it's proposed that this wording is added. Where a political group does not wish to take up its allocation of a seat on a standing panel or review group, it will first be offered to political groups that would not normally have a seat allocation through the cross-party principal guide for appointment to standing panels and review groups. The seat will be offered to those political groups in priority order based on strongest entitlement to a seat as per political proportionality calculations. Should there be no take-up of the seat after offering to other political groups, the committee will decide what to do. So the committee is recommended to agree the revised cross-party principal guide as set out in the report, and delegate authority to me to update the scrutiny operating principles to reflect that change. Agree the allocation of 6 seats to the Finance and Performance Panel, Housing and Homelessness Panel, Climate and Environment Panel, and 4 seats on the Company Scrutiny Panel for the remainder of this year. To appoint the members nominated by political groups, and previously, I won't restate them, to those panels, and agree to reappoint existing chairs for the remainder of this year in the interest of continuity. Agree that membership of Finance and Performance Panel, including the chair, will continue to comprise the membership of Budget Review Group for this year, and approve the wording that I've just read out in respect of what to do if a seat is not taken up by a political group in the operating principles. That's all from me.
Thanks. Any questions? Chris?
You might want to mention. You might want to mention briefly what you do in event of a tie, given that the Green Group and the Socialist Independent Group are equal numbers. So it's the situation you might end up with is that they're both equally entitled to a member.
I'd probably suggest that in that situation, it might be for the committee to decide what to do, if that's acceptable.
I imagine that's acceptable. I guess most committees have 6 people on them, so most committees everyone gets 1 person. Labour get 2, but yeah, if would everyone be happy if it's that scrutiny votes on who gets the place? Is that probably the fairest system? We'd have, yeah, I feel like that's the fairest system for dealing with that. Great. So if we add that to the operating principles,
it's already covered.
Is it already covered?
Yeah, I can add it.
Could add something to make it just more explicit about what would happen in that situation. Cool. Anything else? No. In that case, final item is note dates of future meetings. I don't think we do.
We probably should, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, and that, can we vote to agree that those are we're happy with those recommendations? Great. And now you can note the dates of future meetings. Thanks.